Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Edward Cheredjian. I'm the founding director of the Baker Institute, and it's my pleasure to greet you this morning. Today's conference hosted by the Baker Institute's Latin America Initiative. We're very pleased that this event has attracted not only a domestic audience, but also an international one in Mexico. We are webcasting live as we speak to the Instituto Mora in Mexico City, and we would like to extend a special welcome to all of you in Mexico as well. This year, we are celebrating at the Institute our 20th anniversary. We are relatively new to the public policy stage, yet we have had an outsized impact in a short amount of time, as are reflected in our top rankings amongst global think tanks. Throughout the year, our programs are highlighting their expertise, excluding today's event on immigration. We're focusing on health policy, energy policy, China, international economics, public finance, and conflict resolution in the Middle East. The Baker Institute Latin America Initiative has served as a bridge between academics, policymakers, and other key stakeholders on the international, domestic, and local level. Today's important conference on immigration reform reflects a key focus of the Baker Institute Latin America Policy Program. We are delighted to be hosting so many distinguished speakers from academia, from government, and from civil society. I would like to thank warmly the Ray C. Fish Foundation for their generous donation that supports this event. I would also like to recognize our Baker Institute personnel, Erica de la Garza, the director of our Latin America Initiative, and our new Baker Institute scholar for immigration and border studies, Dr. Tony Payan, for all their efforts in putting this conference together. The timing of the deliberations today could not be better. As Congress returned yesterday, the bipartisan group of 8 senators is set to release their plan for reforms aiming to strengthen border security, create a new guest worker program, and put forward a path to citizenship to increase opportunities for the estimated 11 million illegal immigrants already in the United States. In addition to the substantive issues, the political considerations surrounding immigration reform debate, the labor unions, the electoral politics, the local government actors are driving the debate for reform. Yet political factors can also limit the policy options that actually can be implemented. The political environment in Washington in which immigration reform is discussed and formulated is absolutely crucial to creating realistic policy recommendations. I hope that this conference will have a positive impact on these deliberations of our policymakers. We certainly will do our best to get the results of this conference to Washington and elsewhere. So I wish you all a very productive conference. I look forward to the discussions. It's now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Dr. Mark Rosenblum, a specialist in immigration policy for the Congressional Research Service, to give you an overview of the current immigration debate negotiations and the political dynamics I referred to surrounding it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rosenblum to the podium.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to Tony and Erica for, and to the Baker Institute for bringing me here. It's a special honor for me to be speaking at Rice because I grew up about 1.5 miles from here, and also makes me nervous because I have some family members in the audience, so it's a totally different feel to be speaking to people that you know than to a bunch of strangers. So. Let me say before I start that the views I'll be expressing today are mine and don't represent, shouldn't be attributed to the Congressional Research Service or the Library of Congress. What I'd like to do to get us started this morning is to say a bit about the broad historical context in which the current immigration debate is occurring. And then I'll talk a bit about some of the specific policy issues that are driving that debate, and as the ambassador said, something about where we are and where we might be going. When you look at immigration policy, one thing that's striking throughout American history is that immigration has been a persistently controversial issue, and Congress has rarely taken swift or decisive action to reform immigration law. And so why is that? I think one way to understand the controversy over immigration policy is to think about three very distinct debates that we have about immigration, or three different dimensions of the immigration debate. And each of them is polarizing and has powerful arguments on both sides of it. So one of those debates, one of those conversations is about the economics of immigration. And on one hand, we're very concerned about making sure that employers have access to the workers that they need and ensuring an adequate labor supply. But on the other hand, we're also interested in protecting U.S. workers from too much competition and ensuring that immigration doesn't drive down U.S. wages. So there's powerful arguments on both sides. And then there's a second question about immigration as an international issue. We're talking about international migration. And on one hand, we're concerned about immigration as a source of public diplomacy and our relationship with Mexico and other countries of origin. And historically, we viewed humanitarian migration in particular as an important foreign policy tool. But on the other hand, we're also concerned about security risks associated with immigration. And, this dates back to the earliest days of the Republic. Some of our first laws, the Alien and Sedition Acts, were to remove aliens who were security threats. And over the years, that's evolved to focus on anarchists and communists and terrorists and criminals more recently. And we'll be talking about that sort of economic dimension and that international dimension, I guess, in the second panel after this one, focusing on current questions about the economics and security issues surrounding immigration. And then there's a third debate that we have about immigration that focuses on social and cultural issues. And on one hand, as a nation of immigrants, we have always celebrated diversity and celebrated immigration. But on the other hand, we also have a very long history of sort of social and cultural anxiety about immigration, especially about the most recent wave of immigrants. And there are powerful arguments on both sides of that dimension as well, and we'll talk about that in the first panel this morning. So when you look at those three different conversations about immigration, the factors that sort of motivate those conversations and that cause them to lean one way or the other are mostly independent of each other. So the economic discussion turns on the business cycle and unemployment and is so follows sort of a business cycle rhythm. The international dimension of the conversation is much more event-driven, and that's illustrated most recently by the 9/11 attacks and the way that transformed a lot of the conversation about immigration. And the sort of social and cultural conversation about immigration has a much longer cycle that has to do with how, over time, new immigrants become Americans and become integrated into the political system. And when you look historically, it's been quite unusual for all three of those cycles to line up in the same direction at the same time. So there have been very few moments in American history where there has been sort of a clear consensus about the direction in which immigration policy should move. And one of those moments was at the turn of the last century, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the security issues around World War I and social revolutions at the time, and the late Industrial Revolution period, and anxiety about new Southern and Eastern European immigrants all sort of came together to motivate restrictionist immigration policies, and Congress passed a series of increasingly restrictive laws over a 20-year period. And then a second moment like that was in the 1960s when, during the post-World War II economic boom and during the Civil Rights Movement, and at a time when we had decades of very limited immigration, all from Europe, and also at a time during the Cold War when there was a great emphasis on the public diplomacy benefits of immigration. All those factors lined up to support sort of liberalizing immigration reform. It appeared in the late 1990s that we might be at a third moment like that. We were at a period of prolonged economic growth during the 1990s, post-Cold War, U.S. hegemony, and after 30 or 40 years of this third wave of immigration, consisting mostly of Latin American and Asian immigration, it appeared that we were at a moment where the social and cultural factors on that dimension were reinforcing the other sort of pro-liberal reform dynamics. And on September 8th, 2001, President Bush and Mexico's President Vicente Fox met and signed a framework agreement to negotiate a major immigration deal that would have looked fairly similar to the issues that we're talking about today. So that agreement was signed September 8th, 2001. The 9/11 attacks happened 3 days later and derailed that specific process, but much of the current debate is sort of a continuation of that conversation that began back in 2001. So let me shift now and say something about that current debate, and I'll come back and pick the story back up. The debate we're having in Washington right now concerns two big ways that the immigration system is broken and 4 or 5 specific policy questions that follow from that. So we often hear that the immigration system is broken. What do we mean by that? Well, the most sort of obvious way in which the system is broken and the obvious manifestation of a broken system is that there are about 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. today, down from about 12 million a few years ago. And we hear that number all the time, but I think it's useful to pause and think about how big that number is. The greater Houston metropolitan area, 10 counties, from south of Galveston to north of Intercontinental Airport and whatever the good east-west, I've been away from Houston a little too long. The whole greater Houston metro area is 6 million people. So if you think of every man, woman, and child in Houston, double that. It's a big issue. And there's a lot of unresolved questions about what to do about such a large number of unauthorized immigrants. And one of the proposals that's on the table, of course, is that some of them should be legalized, or that most of them should be legalized. But there are many unresolved questions about exactly what that means. How many should be legalized? What should that process look like? What should they be entitled to as a result of being legalized? What additional requirements will people have to meet in order to be legalized? It's also important to realize that that large number of unauthorized immigrants exists despite the fact that the United States has invested extraordinary resources over the last 2 or 3 decades in immigration enforcement. Last year, the U.S. spent about $18 billion on immigration enforcement, which is more than all other federal law enforcement priorities combined. So most of what the federal government does in the law enforcement arena is immigration control. Most of the immigration control effort is at the border and to a lesser degree in jails and prisons. So there's wide recognition that one thing that we probably don't do enough of is worksite enforcement. And legally, employers it's illegal for an employer to knowingly hire an unauthorized immigrant, but we don't have a good system in place to give employers the tools to know whether a worker is here legally or not. And partly for that reason, we don't have strong oversight, strong enforcement of that provision, and it's very unusual for employers to be held accountable for knowingly hiring an unauthorized immigrant. So it raises two additional policy questions that relate to this large unauthorized population are, how can we create an effective worksite enforcement system, a verification system and an enforcement system? And then what other immigration enforcement measures should be put in place on top of the large enforcement infrastructure that already exists? So those are 3 issues: legalization, worksite enforcement, other enforcement, that relate directly to the unauthorized population. The second way that the system is broken is that there's not a good match between the supply and demand of visas. And one way that we know this is true is that there are currently about 4.5 million people, so that's another big number, who have already been approved to get a visa to come to the U.S. permanently, to get a green card and eventually be able to apply for citizenship, who have been approved for a visa, but for whom there is no visa available under existing numeric limits. So many people get approved for visas, but then don't have a visa available for them. So that's sort of a design flaw in our permanent visa system. And there's also arguably a design flaw in our temporary visa system through which many employers seek to hire temporary workers because many people who hire unauthorized workers and many people who want to hire legal workers, whether they're low-skilled or high-skilled, find it difficult to find a visa that's available through a process that they are able to use. So many employers who seek to hire foreign workers don't see that there's a visa available that they're able to use. So this raises the final two policy questions, which are, what changes should we make to the permanent visa system to ensure that there's a better match, to ensure that there aren't people waiting for decades to get a visa, and that may mean changing who's eligible, or it may mean changing the number of visas available, or some combination of that. And then the final question is, what changes should we make to the non-immigrant visa system, which we often think of as temporary worker programs that would allow employers to recruit employment-based immigrants who may or may not be coming to the country permanently. So when we talk about comprehensive immigration reform, which I'll probably slip into the habit of calling that CIR. That's the initials that we use in Washington to mean comprehensive immigration reform. That is a shorthand for addressing all 5 of those policy questions in one piece of legislation. CIR means, what are we going to do about legalization, worksite enforcement, other immigration enforcement, permanent visa reform, and temporary visa reform. And there's a political logic to taking this on comprehensively, because when you look at that list, some of those issues are especially of concern to the left broadly, and some of them are especially concerned to the right, so we can think about a grand bargain to bring them together. But there's also a policy logic which has to do with, when you think about those 2 problems that I mentioned, lots of unauthorized immigrants and a bad fit between the supply and demand of visas, obviously those are related. So, some of the advocates for a comprehensive approach will argue that you can't really fix the enforcement system without fixing the visa system, and you can't really have a visa system that works without an effective enforcement system. There's also important counter-arguments, and one is that we know that grand bargains are hard to strike. Grand left-right coalitions are hard to hold together, and the U.S. system, on most issues doesn't do comprehensive bills. It does small bills, one at a time. And it's not clear that we can't do, for example, effective enforcement without visa reforms, because we know that we haven't really tried that, in particular with worksite enforcement. So I'm running out of time before I'm running out of notes. So let me quickly say something about where we are and where we might be headed. Where we are, as the ambassador said, is the president has laid out principles for a comprehensive bill that he would like to see. This group of 8 senators from both parties have also laid out principles, and we expect them to introduce a bill sort of any day now that will make concrete those principles. There's also a group in the House that is seeking to introduce a bill. There are definitely reasons to think that this may be the moment where we get this done. And, those reasons have to do with those 3 broad dimensions that I talked about. When you look at those dimensions, on the international dimension, we're a bit farther away from 9/11 than we were the last time that we did this. And more importantly, we've put in place a lot of new enforcement measures at the borders and at ports of entry that create at least the beginning of a credible enforcement system with respect to the security concerns that have been on the table in the post 9/11 period. In the economic dimension, having weathered 2 severe economic downturns, to the extent that we're in a recovery and seeing job production resume, that really brings business groups back to the immigration debate after they left the immigration debate during the economic downturn in Obama's first term. And the thing that brings many of us here today is this sort of social and cultural dimension. And we've all heard a lot about the Latino vote in the 2012 election. That's really an indication that we have continued to move from Latinos and Asian immigrants as cultural threat to those immigrants as cultural or as political force rather than political threat. And most demographers will tell you that those trends are not going away anytime soon. So those are all reasons to be optimistic that we may see a bill happen this time around. And another general reason to feel optimistic about that is that when you look around at the set of issues that Congress and the White House are concerned with today, there's very few others that seem to have more common ground. And if the parties are looking for a place to reach an agreement, immigration is a great candidate. But let me just end on a more pessimistic note by pointing out, unfortunately, by pointing out that where we are is at the very beginning of a long process. We expect that we're about to see bills introduced. That gets followed by hearings and markups and possibly floor debates in both chambers, which may produce bills that may or may not look somewhat similar to each other. So there's a lot of potential roadblocks between now, or a lot of potential speed bumps at least, between now and a signing ceremony at the White House. And when you look at the specific policy questions that I laid out, the 4 or 5 issues that are going to be on the table, every single one of those is hotly contested and disagreed upon. The fact that the Gang of 8 in the Senate appears close to getting a bill on the table, they've been negotiating that bill really for several years now, and they still can't come, they still haven't quite gotten to a point where the 8 of them agree. So to think about all the different places where we may have a challenge getting 60 votes in the Senate and 218 votes in the House, the devil will be in the details. And I look forward and hope that we'll spend some time today talking about what some of those details might be and how they overlap with these different dimensions that I've highlighted, and look forward to seeing how this plays out. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Erika de la Garza, and I'm going to ask the panelists in the the people in the first panel to please take a seat over here. Given our tight agenda and in the interest of time, I'm also going to ask you to please look at the bios of our speakers in your program so that we don't spend time going over them. And I want to thank each and every one of the speakers for being with us today and for the many contributions they do to the immigration debate. So our discussant, the way we're going to do this is each panelist will have 10 minutes to present us their findings, and then the discussant will moderate the panel and will also make comments on their findings. Our discussant this morning for the first panel is Jason Maxark, who is the Director of Policy at the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas, as well as the Senior Editor of the Americas Quarterly, which, by the way, I highly recommend you subscribe to if you don't do so already. It's a great publication. Jason, thank you so much for being with us, and I love you.
Thanks, Erica. And I'd like to thank you and the ambassador and the Baker Institute for the invitation, and congratulate them to putting such a timely conference. I assume that you knew months ago when you're putting this together that this was going to possibly be the week as Mark was talking about, that immigration reform might be dropped in the Senate. So great foresight. This is particularly timely. And one of the things that we've seen is just kind of setting up this panel, is that with discussions of immigration reform, as Mark so eloquently talked about, moving forward at the national level, we've seen various groups and associations, some of which have consistently played a role in CIR. I'll use the acronym Mark introduced before, Comprehensive Immigration Reform Discussions, and some of our new actors have been really ramping up their efforts on talking about what CIR means, what are the implications of it, and how has this come about. And there's been a lot of discussion at the national level as well. And the result is really a barrage of information for many information that is known to many people who have consistently followed the debate and the discussions, and much information that is not known. But what's missing and what our panelists today will talk about is to think about immigration is a more nuanced focused on immigration reform. Why now, and what must be addressed in the short to long term, especially hopefully if comprehensive immigration reform passes in regard to immigrant integration. So for that, we're presenting 4 papers. I'll introduce quickly the panelists. I won't give their bios since, as Erica said, you have those. But to my right is Ali Valenzuela from Princeton University, who will present on Latino issue priorities and political behavior across U.S. contexts. To Ali's right is David Leal, who is at the University of Texas Austin and will present on Latinos, public opinion, and immigration reform. To David's right is Jason Ackelson from New Mexico State University, who will present on U.S. immigration, demography, and citizenship in a digital age. And to Jason's right is Shannon Gleason of UC Santa Cruz and Licia Abrego of UCLA, who will present on immigration policies hurt families more than they help. Each author will have about 10 to 12 minutes to present their paper, after which I will present reflections on those papers. We'll have the panelists present in order listed on the agenda. So with that, I'd like to ask Ali to begin.
Thanks. It's up there. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you. I wanted to thank Erica and Tony Payan for organizing this great conference, and of course to the Baker Institute for hosting us all today. And I also want to thank Mark, actually, for that broad overview of the current debate that we'll be engaging here today, because my paper goes in a particular detail where I'm not really dealing with the broad overview, but I'm focusing specifically on Latino opinion here in the U.S. and specifically how opinion varies across different U.S. contexts. And I'll get into more about what I mean in a second. So I don't think I need to go over the state of immigration policy under President Obama. Mark did a bit of reviewing for us on that. But the basic punchline, the basic takeaway is that there's been very little progress on reform, but a substantial increase in enforcement of immigration. Right, so Obama has deported a record number of persons during his first term, or at least his administration has. And there's been a shift from border enforcement to primarily interior enforcement. Right, so we know some of the consequences in terms of families, in terms of individual lives that these policies have, but there's also other consequences that I'm here, that I'm going to evaluate today, and that is for how Latino public opinion and political behavior responds to these sorts of government action, or in the case of reform, inaction. And so I'm specifically interested in Latino attention to the immigration issue generally, and also, of course, just in terms of support for comprehensive immigration reform specifically. And then, importantly, I'm also interested in 2 key political outcomes. One is party identification of Latino voters, and then 2 is their willingness to support President Obama in the previous election, and how specifically attention to the immigration issue impacts those 2 key outcomes. And so to my mind, in order to get at these key outcomes, we want to understand the attention that Latinos are devoting to this particular issue, because if they're not paying attention, if it's not something that's significant for their political lives, they're not likely to rely on this issue to make political decisions. And so to understand Latino attention, I'm interested in how this varies across U.S. contexts. So I have a few specific research questions. In the first place, does attention actually vary by key Latino subgroups? And I'm specifically interested in nativity, national origin, and also party identification. At a basic level, given my interest, does attention also vary across contexts? So I'm specifically interested in a couple things. So one is differences across levels of context, right? So we might think that one's county of residence is important, but at the same time, we know that counties are quite large. And so maybe it's actually more important to think about the specific neighborhoods in which Latino voters live. And then in terms of the specific measures of context in these different levels, I'm interested in, for example, population dynamics. So in places where the Latino population is quite large or where it's quite small relative to other groups, where, for example, there's a large Mexican origin population versus a large Puerto Rican origin population. And then I'm also interested in general about electoral context. And so how does stiff competition between the two parties, how does that affect the way in which the immigration issue is debated and communicated in terms of campaign appeals, in terms of other aspects of politics in these competitive places? And then lastly, of course, as I mentioned, the key interest is really how then attention to this issue gets translated into party identification and vote choice. I won't bore you too much with the details of the data that I'm using, but in essence, these are 4 cross-sectional surveys, public opinion surveys of Latino voters. So they're registered voters, so they're all citizens here. And they were interviewed in each of the 4 years of President Obama's first term. And I use voter addresses to merge with public opinion various measures of context. So as you see there, census demographic information, but also county level election results. And in terms of how I'm measuring attention to immigration, each of these polls, each of these surveys asks a question about which issue is the most important for Latino voters. There's 2 versions of this question that I analyze. So one asks about the most important issue in general that leaders should pursue, and the other asks about the most important issue facing the Latino community that leaders should address. So unfortunately, all of the surveys don't ask both questions, but in 2011, that survey did ask both versions of the question. So I'm going to be able to compare how the change in wording actually shifted attention to the immigration issue. And so because response options are mutually exclusive, we can take a person identifying immigration as their top concern as a measure of issue salience or the importance or the attention that the individual voter is devoting to this issue. So as I mentioned, in terms of differences in question wording, we can see in 2011 that actually for every important subgroup, Latino subgroup, attention to immigration is always greater when the question is asked about the most important issue facing the Latino community. In addition, it's Puerto Ricans who register the lowest attention to this issue in both versions of the question, right? So Puerto Ricans at 9% for the top issue in general is lower than every other subgroup, and similarly at 16% in the top issue for Latino community version, it's also lower than any other group. And this is really the only group for the top issue for the Latino community that registers any decrease in their attention relatively to the other groups. In other words, so Cubans, for example, Republican Latinos, they're all just as willing to say that immigration is a top issue when it concerns the Latino community. But Puerto Ricans are not. Puerto Ricans seem to just register less attention to this issue, think it's less important both in general and also for the Latino community. If we compare 2011 to 2012, again on the top issue for the Latino community, there seems to be a decline in attention to this issue. And my sense of this is that it's the political campaign, the political election that's driving attention away from immigration and towards other issues such as the economy, right? And we can see this most clearly, I think, with the decline among Cubans and Republicans, right? So between 2011 and 2012, for these two groups, attention to immigration dropped considerably. And given that that's not really the wheelhouse of the Republican Party, it's not too surprising that these particular Latinos would say that they're less, that this issue is less important in 2012 than in 2011. So what we really care about, though, is whether we can predict attention to this issue, controlling for some of these individual level characteristics that I just mentioned, such as national origin, generation, nativity, et cetera, as well as measures of context, right? Because that's the key test. Whether once we account for these individual characteristics that I've just shown you lead to differences in attention, does context still matter? Right? So I won't bother with the tables, but I'll show you some graphs in a second. What these graphs do is they plot the predicted probability of identifying immigration as a top issue, and it plots them across the range of Latino population. So from 0% Latino all the way up to 99%, well, 100%, but it's like 99.9% Latino in some counties. In the data set that I'm looking at. And importantly, these predicted probabilities also control for these individual level characteristics and other measures of context all at the same time. So surprisingly, or at least surprising to me, as the Latino population increases, Latinos actually appear to register less attention to the immigration issue. And I say this is surprising to me because I expected the opposite. I expected that in places with larger Latino populations, there would be greater attention to this issue. But in fact, the probability of identifying this as a top issue among Latino voters declines from a high of 35% in the least Hispanic counties to a low of 10% in the most Hispanic. And so interestingly, what does increase across the Latino population at the county level is attention to the economy, right? And so I take from this one of my policy recommendations, which is that anytime that there's a possibility of highlighting or talking about the economic benefits of immigration reform. This is something that the Latino community, as well as just the business community and other communities, can get around, can get behind, right? So although there are these differences in across national origin groups, across the populations, if we can talk about immigration reform as an economic issue, this is also a way in which the Latino community can come together around immigration reform. In the interest of time, I won't talk about my competitive analysis, but the basic punchline is that competition does appear to reverse this trend. So in places that are electorally competitive, increasing Latino population share is actually related to greater attention to immigration among Latino voters. So my take on this is that in places that are electorally competitive, that are close races, you're going to see candidates on both sides of the aisle vying for the Latino vote and talking about immigration and immigration reform in a positive way, in a way in which appeals to Latino voters and in turn drives an increase in attention to the issue. But moving on to the kind of key point, right, the key punchline. Is immigration or attention to immigration related to party identification? Well, I find that it is, and I find that it is controlling for, again, a number of individual characteristics as well as these measures of context. And what I find is that among all Latinos in my sample, attention to saying that immigration is their top issue compared to other issues increases the likelihood of Democratic Party identification by about 12 percentage points. And interestingly, this effect is largest in border states and quite modest in non-border states. On the other hand, or similarly for vote choice, again, I also find that attention to immigration increases the likelihood that Latino voters will support President Obama over Governor Mitt Romney. And once again, this effect is driven primarily by Latinos who reside in border states. And in non-border states, interestingly, it looks like the economy, right? So those Latinos who selected the economy as their top issue were more likely to support Mitt Romney over President Obama. So again, this to me suggests another area for policy recommendation, right, or a policy implication, is that when we're talking about immigration reform, it's not necessarily one single message that's going to do the trick, right? We need to be thinking about where we're targeting our messages, where Latino voters live, and the different concerns and competing concerns of Latinos living in different places in the U.S. So just in summary, as I mentioned, Latino attention to immigration is not equally distributed. In some results that I haven't presented here, but that are in the paper, there are important differences controlling for all these other factors, important differences by income, by national origin, and nativity or generation, right? So higher income Latinos, non-Mexican Latinos, and later generation Latinos all register significantly less attention to this issue. Attention declines with increasing Latino population, but that's in contrast to attention to jobs or the economy. And then electoral competition does appear to reverse this pattern, leading to greater attention to immigration with increasing Latino population. And then finally, it's immigration, the issue of immigration, that's really most directly tied to the to Democratic Party identification, as well as support for President Obama in this last election. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ali. David.
Well, thank you to Tony and Erica for inviting me to this conference, and also thank you to whoever came up with this great, clever graphic with the Homeland Security stamp with the date of the conference on that. I really like that. That's cool. If they could have stamped our names here, that would have been like a really great extra touch too. But so, like Mark, I'll start with the disclaimer, which is that. But I'll say instead that I'm not really sure who my views represent. Maybe they represent me, but some of these ideas just kind of popped into my head, and so I'm not sure if I want to completely take credit for all of them. They seem pretty interesting, so I wrote them down, but these are, and I don't think I have like sort of necessarily sort of social science proof for all of them. I usually write empirical papers, and this is a bit of more of a contextual kind of paper, so maybe I can't prove anything that I say, but I think there's good reason to think that what I'm saying might actually be the case, but we'll find out. So the paper discusses the Latino dimension of the new post-election immigration debate. I'll discuss the role of public opinion only in its very broadest sense. The paper has more details about public opinion surveys from places like the Pew and the Politics and Religion Research Institute, which has a good new survey. But I think that the details of public opinion are maybe not really what's driving this debate, and I'll discuss that. So not long ago, I'll start by saying the prospects for immigration reform were very poor, and I won't go into the details. I think you all know that. The discussion was more about anchor babies. It was more about ending birthright citizenship, terror babies, than it really was about coming up with some sort of comprehensive immigration reform plan. But as they say, what a difference a day makes, and the difference was Election Day, and I think we all know that too, with Obama winning about 71% of the Latino vote on his way to re-election. Now, the Republican Party was surprised by both of these results, both the high Latino support, but also the fact of the victory in some places. So by connecting the dots, a new conversation began within the Republican Party. Can we win elections without taking into account the growing diversity of the nation and the electorate? And this just changed the debate from deporting grandma to negotiations about a pathway to citizenship. And a lot of pundits now think that immigration reform is going to pass this year, this week, this afternoon. And what I'd like to discuss, though, is some other features of American politics that may have helped to smooth this shift in the conversation so that it's not just about the election. I'd like to suggest, maybe with a little bit of 20/20 hindsight, that the policy environment may have been riper for change than was often thought. So the first thing I want to just mention briefly, and we only have so much time, so I can't go into too much discussion here, was the U.S. in a nativist period for much of the last decade? There are many people who will say that we've been in this nativist era, that we've had nativist time periods in the U.S. before, and that this was one of them over the last decade. And we saw, as a whole, that the immigration climate of the 2000s saw unprecedented levels of enforcement, large numbers of deportations. But there are other signs, I think, that suggest that the policy environment can't just be simply characterized as nativist. So, for example, just to take one instance, while some localities and states sought to enforce immigration laws and make life more difficult for the unauthorized, there were a lot of other jurisdictions that sought to expand immigrant rights. And it seems that about for every law that was passed restricting immigrants, there was a law passed expanding immigrant rights. But this really hasn't received a lot of press, but it was nevertheless there. I also think we don't want to study immigration policy in isolation from other kinds of policy developments in America. And we'll need the perspective of time to better understand current trends, but I think that there may be a kind of libertarian dimension emerging in politics that may be influencing several policy debates all at the same time. This goes back to at least 2008. People have talked about a libertarian moment. I don't know if we're in a complete moment, but I think there are some elements of our policy like this. And so, for example, I think that with same-sex marriage, with don't ask, don't tell, and also with some elements of marijuana legalization and reform rethinking, we might also put immigration reform into this too. A principled belief in limited government might sort of influence all of these policy areas at the same time. The next point I want to make is that we're also seeing a change in religious dynamics that are helping to promote CIR. In particular, we see many evangelical leaders and organizations that are now advocating a path to legalization. And this goes far beyond the usual kind of groups of liberal religious people and organizations that have advocated for CIR. And this is partly a theological change going on within evangelical Christianity. It's a sort of a new focus on biblical teachings, a new focus on the actual words of the Bible, the actual words of Jesus, especially what the Bible teaches about the stranger. Some people call this the red letter movement. But there's also demographically a growing Latino presence in evangelical and Pentecostal churches. And so I think there's a new Time magazine cover story coming out either this week or next week called the Latino Reformation. And it's about how Latinos are quantitatively and qualitatively changing American Protestantism. And since that's where we're seeing this sort of new push from CIRs coming from more evangelical Pentecostal Protestant movements, I think this is really very interesting. I think we also have to take into account that it's the Latino, Asian American, and other immigrant populations together that may have passed a sort of tipping point beyond which anti-immigration politics is self-defeating. It's not only a Latino story. We know about Latino population growth. We know about its movement across the country. But sometimes we forget that the Asian American vote is also growing, and that it actually was stronger for Obama than the Latino vote was in 2012. I think we also have to take into account the importance of history and the importance of historical narrative. Until recently in the immigration debates, especially on the conservative side, the main historical event people were talking about was IRCA. They were talking about IRCA as a program where, yes, there was the legalization, but then the enforcement didn't happen, and so when conservatives talked about immigration, that was the historical event they talked about. Today in the Republican Party, the story that everybody seems to be talking about is California in the 1990s. And we've known about that. I don't think I have to tell you about the sort of narrative, which is, I think, a bit more complicated than its popular telling, but essentially how with the anti-immigrant and the immigration skeptic ballot initiatives of the 1990s, Latinos in California sort of, mobilized against the GOP and helped to turn California from red to blue. That seems to be the narrative that's coming out, substitute California for America, and this is the fear that if they get behind on the immigration issue for too much longer, they may end up in a permanent minority status. Another point I'll bring up is that there's, I think, tentative evidence that immigration politics has failed as a wedge issue. So there were some in the mid-2000s who thought that immigration politics might work for the GOP, but there really haven't been a lot of good success stories. There haven't been very many candidates that have really sort of rode immigration skeptic politics to victory, and there have been some cases of candidates who have rode it to defeat. So it seems that conservative political strategists may now believe that the time has come to jettison a losing tactic. The paper also talks a little bit about ways to think about Latino opinion about immigration debates that go beyond basic poll numbers. And so one key question is, how does immigration influence the Latino vote? And I don't think it's just about sort of graphs about what Latinos think. And one distinction may be a variant of what Tishner called immigration policy versus immigrant policy. And so I'm thinking of this as terms of immigration policy versus immigrant politics. So yes, there's policy. Latinos have opinions about this aspect of immigration reform or that. But I think that sort of exact nature is less important than this sort of emerging feeling that the politics of immigration has really become very negative in a way that indicts all Latinos. In normal time periods, Latino views about immigration are actually more diverse than people think, and there are even some conservative strands in there, some significant ones. But when you feel like you're under attack as a community, that changes, and it's no longer your sort of individual detailed opinions about this or that matter. It's really your sense of what's happening in the politics of immigration, and I think that helps to fuel things like the 2012 election results. So I think that Republicans face a status quo that doesn't really give them many easy options. A legalization plan may alienate some parts of their base, and it may also create millions of new Democratic voters. Because Latinos have fairly favorable views of big government, taxation, and spending, and they don't politically prioritize social issues like abortion, substantial GOP recruitment is, I think, unlikely. But the status quo is also self-defeating if they continue with this 70, 71, 72% Latino vote for Democratic candidates. This is going to prove increasingly problematic to their electoral college calculations. The Democrats could consolidate a solid Southwest. They could regularly win Florida. They could tip swing states. They wouldn't even have to turn Texas blue, and Texas could stay as red as it is. They just really wouldn't even need that state. But they don't really need to win the Latino vote, and that's where the debate gets confusing. They really probably just need to stay about where their average was until recently, maybe about 1/3 of the vote, maybe occasionally reaching up into Ronald Reagan's 35%, maybe occasionally moving up into George W. Bush's 40%. And so they may conclude that their best long-term strategy is just to take the issue off the table. It might also enhance the prospects of their fairly deep bench of Latino Republican potential candidates. So we have the emerging George P. Bush, we have U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, Governor Susana Martinez of New Mexico, and Brian Sandoval of Nevada. Can they do well, especially among minority voters, and Latinos in particular, if the GOP is perceived as anti-immigrant? And so maybe a policy parallel is from the 1990s with President Clinton and welfare reform. So the inelegantly named Perora in the 1990s. So maybe what they want to do is remove this wedge issue, just like the Democrats tried to remove welfare politics. The Democratic Party reluctantly gave on substance in order to adjust to the political environment. So maybe that's the historical kind of policy parallel to think about. Another possibility is that the new immigration debate reflects internal GOP disagreements. So while these kind of generalizations can be difficult, perhaps the more moderate, but sometimes people call the establishment Republicans, would like to move the GOP toward the ideological center, and they see the immigration issue as a good place to start. So by emphasizing the fact of a diversifying electorate, they're trying to change the discussion from ideology to practicality. And so the Romney defeat may have actually opened a window for this kind of discussion. Illustrative of Republican worries about the immigration issue is the claim that President Obama doesn't really want immigration reform to pass for political reasons. I've heard that a couple times recently. And I think this indicates that the president may actually have, and Democrats may have, an actually fairly strong hand here, even if they need to sort of distance themselves from everyday negotiations to minimize Republican congressional opposition. But I think in many ways the risk is really all on the GOP side in this negotiation. Because in many ways, the political status quo favors Democrats, certainly numerically. Despite large numbers of deportation, it's the GOP that is mostly seen, especially by Latinos, as the anti-immigrant party. So if you look at surveys for Latinos and African Americans, and you ask them, which party do you trust more on the immigration issue? Very large margins trust the Democrats, much more than the Republicans. And even with CIR, even without, CIR, the Latino population and electorate continues to grow. It's mostly Democratic. The newest voters may be overwhelmingly Democratic. If reform fails, most Latinos will probably blame Republicans. Democrats will continue to have a classic wedge issue. So I think, as I said, the risk really is all on the GOP side in trying to make this happen. Although I think, and this is the last thing I'll say, that even if it does pass, there's no guarantee that Republicans will receive large numbers of new Latino votes. After all, will Latino voters, organizations, and leaders just forget about the last few years? Is the Latino brand problematic for many Latinos, especially for the newest, youngest voters? Could a Latino Republican presidential candidate change all these perceptions? I don't think we know that. And will changing immigration positions help the GOP if it advocates other policies that Democrats argue are aimed at reducing Latino political power and influence, like voter identification and this birth certificates for voter registration? So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And I think both Ali and David's papers both set the stage on immigration politics and immigration priorities. And as we move to Jason and then Shannon Leasy, our shift on this panel is going to focus beyond the politics and issue priorities, more on the demographic trends, family policies, and issues that are both important as part of CIR, but also issues that are critical, even independent of CIR. Jason.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. Thank you, Tony and Erica, for inviting me back down to the Baker Institute and Rice. It's always a pleasure to be here and speak to a great group of citizens, scholars, political actors here who are concerned with this issue, both in this area as well as the country. One quick note on my affiliation going in. I am currently an associate professor of government at New Mexico State University, but I'm also on leave, as my bio suggests in the program. I'm on leave, and I'm actually working at the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, and our role in this whole thing is to actually implement whatever comes about with CIR. So while the issues I talk about are definitely in USCIS's lane, for sure, none of the opinions I express today are actually official agency policy. So with that caveat, I'll begin. And I guess my paper comes to this conference and this panel specifically in the latter half of the title, The Face of America, almost taking a little bit of a step back from the debate to sort of understand what exactly are the demographic facts on the ground of the foreign-born or immigrant population we have in the United States. So we can really understand when we talk about policy reform what it is, what the population we're dealing with is all about, what they look like, where they live, what are their characteristics, trends, and so on. And that's really what my paper really speaks to, and what I'll try to present very quickly today. Oops. Okay, so here's a quick outline of what I'm going to try to do. Very quick demographic snapshot, the face of America, if you will, of the foreign-born in the United States. Then I'm going to move to look very quickly at a few integration issues. This was mentioned earlier by Mark and others. How do we see trends in movement from people who have green cards or are legal permanent residents to becoming citizens? And what kind of trends or barriers may exist in that process for those individuals? And then I'm going to introduce very quickly an interesting new idea that comes from some literature now on the idea of digital citizenship. We think about citizenship as naturalization, and that's really going to be a big focus of mine. But also there's some other elements of the idea of digital citizenship that I think are important to talk about in the debate. Okay, so the demography of the foreign-born. I could not resist that picture of the little one on the bottom right. We'll talk again here about the face of America. And as Mark alluded to earlier, from the beginnings of our republic, demography and immigration have played a critical role in describing and forming the fabric of our country. It's no less the case today. By 2042 or maybe 2050, demographers predict that we will be living in a minority-majority country. And a sizable segment of that population will be the foreign-born or second-generation immigrants. And I think it's really important when we talk about debates and policy that we understand the political, socioeconomic, and economic implications of these demographic shifts. And that's what this paper tries to do. So looking first at the foreign-born as a percentage of the United States population. It is high, but not quite at record levels. If you look at historical census data, it seems as though the percentage of the foreign-born peaked in about 1890 at about 14.8 or 15% more or less of the U.S. population. Since then, it's, of course, ebbed and flowed, but then it increased quite significantly in the 1980s with the trend markedly upward. What is interesting also to note, though, if you look at the latter years, is that the trend is somewhat leveled off. And if you, a recent report out of the Pew Hispanic Center actually talked about this and confirmed that the growth of the immigrant population in the United States is actually, between 2009 and 2011, was actually rather limited at only approximately 2%. So we're seeing some changes in the foreign-born that I think are important to sort of understand when we're thinking about immigration reform going forward. Now, when you drill into that data a little bit further and you think about the country of origin of the foreign-born in the United States, some interesting things come about. First off, a couple of points in this chart. The growth of the Latin American and Asian-born populations relative to past trends which were centered on sending countries in Europe is really quite apparent. The share of the foreign-born from Europe has declined markedly in the United States, from about 75% of the foreign-born in 1960 to approximately 12% now in 2010. Whereas the foreign-born from Latin America have conversely increased significantly. The other thing I would point out in this chart, actually, is the deep blue bars on the 2000 and 2010 years. And those represent the percentage of the foreign-born from Mexico. And what's interesting to see there is that the Mexican origin foreign-born population is actually somewhat stabilized in the last 10, 12, 13 years or so. And I think that's, again, indicative of some other demographic trends and changes in Mexico that are important to understand in the context of CIR and other debates that we're having. Other thing that's quite interesting to look at is geography of the foreign-born. Where do they live? What's happening with their receiving communities and so on? And census data reveals that the foreign-born are very widely distributed in the United States, but also clustered in some very interesting geographic locales. Many of these are traditional destinations for immigrants, like Texas, but others, like Kansas, North Carolina, and other places, are new destinations. And I guess the key point to be drawn from the geography of the foreign-born is that immigrants tend to be settling in non-traditional locales. And that poses a variety of economic, socioeconomic, and then, as we've heard in the last couple of papers, political implications for the discussions around immigration, and particularly issues of integration of immigrants in different communities around the United States, and the receptivity of immigrants among native-born Americans. A couple of other interesting trends in the foreign-born I wanted to highlight. One trend that I think is interesting, or data, a source that I like to look at for this in terms of English proficiency. It's often asked, what is the language proficiency of the foreign-born or immigrants in the United States? And I think the way we try to look at that is through the term of limited English proficiency, or LEP status. And actually, there's about 9% of our entire aggregate U.S. population which is classified as limited English proficient. That population is actually growing quite significantly. And when you drill in and you try to discern that for the foreign-born, there's about 17 million foreign-born who speak a language other than English at home, and over half of those don't speak English well or not at all. And when you go into it and look at it by language, Spanish speakers particularly seem to have some language challenges going forward among the foreign-born. About 11 million foreign-born have a first language of Spanish, but 7 million of them speak English either not well or not at all. And this poses some integration challenges, demographers might argue, or scholars of immigration, because English continues to be the gateway language for economic and cultural integration. So focusing on developing language proficiency among new immigrants is an important part of the debate that I'm not sure we've talked about yet, but I think needs to be thought of. The second piece also, and this gets to my idea of digital citizenship I'll conclude with, has to do with internet access. And it's interesting to kind of go and look at the data on internet access among the foreign-born. And while we all probably in this room, and 81% of us overall in America, use the internet, the rates are not so high among the foreign-born or immigrant populations, interestingly enough. There's significant gaps in internet access that exist among certain population groups. And this can be explained by a variety of different variables like education, income, geography, and so on. When we look at foreign-born Latinos, only 51%, according to surveys conducted by the Pew Hispanic Center, use the internet. And only 45% have a home internet connection, which is quite surprising, I think. These are rates very dramatically below native-born Latinos. Of the Mexican-born foreign population, less than half have internet access at home, which I think is quite a startling fact. And many rural destination spaces where the foreign-born are settling lag behind in broadband access. And I think this gets to my final point that I'll make later on, that in order to be full members of a digitally oriented economy and society, these kind of gaps, socioeconomic gaps, need to be addressed, deficiencies need to be addressed. So some quick implications of these trends. immigration is going to continue to play a vital role in the demographic future of the United States. No surprise to that. Over the last 40 years, about a third of our population growth was due to immigration, the increases in the foreign-born population and their native-born children. Now, while fertility rates are actually on the decline among both immigrants and native-born Americans, this trend, I think, can be reasonably expected to be sustained. However, the diversity of the foreign-born population will continue to shift. We're going to see changes in country of origin continue to be a characteristic of our country for the foreseeable future. We see the foreign-born will be increasingly settling in non-traditional locations, which pose important questions about their reception and integration. And then finally, some significant socioeconomic gaps persist in the foreign-born population, certain segments of the foreign-born population that I think have a direct bearing on the issues of immigrant integration, which is what I turn to next. Integration is a big, big topic. I'm not going to be able to focus on any economic, cultural, socioeconomic elements of it. The main piece I want to focus on when we talk about integration is what I would call civic integration, and that's best represented by naturalization. So you might ask, well, are these immigrants that we have in the United States, are they naturalizing once they become legal permanent residents? And if so, at what rate? Well, this chart actually shows U.S. naturalizations over a broad scope of time. And as you can see, the rate has changed, but has definitely escalated in the last 10, 20 years, expanding dramatically. What this chart doesn't necessarily show you, though, is that despite this fairly large absolute number of naturalizations, there's still actually a fairly significant gap in the number of people who are eligible to become U.S. citizens and those who elect to do so. As a matter of fact, there's about 8 million eligible LPRs right now in the United States. Out of a total population of 12.6 million who are eligible to naturalize but have not. And our rate of naturalization falls fairly well below some of comparable English-speaking countries like Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. The question, of course, is why that is, and there's a variety of different explanations to it. Thank you. When you look at it, particularly among certain subgroups, I would say that it's very important to look at, for example, the Mexican-born population. They seem to be naturalizing at a lower rate relative to other country of origin populations. And that, I think, is an important question as to why that may be. And I think it's something we should think about when we go to the immigration debate and say, let's think about what happens after we move people into a legal status. How can we encourage them? What barriers may exist moving them to a full citizenship once that may become a path available to them? In the interest of time, I think I'll go to my final slide here and talk a little bit about the takeaways, I would say, from the paper. The data in the paper make it clear that while the foreign-born in the United States are an increasingly diverse, youthful, geographically diffuse group and growing group, barriers to citizenship mean that a significant portion of their numbers remain less than full members of our society, and thus are at risk for being suboptimally integrated. So this leads to the main takeaway, that in considering important reforms of our system, we should not lose focus on the issue of immigrant integration. And ideally, this is through not only the acquisition of legal citizenship, through naturalization, but also what I talk about in the paper as digital citizenship. That is to say, having the linguistic and digital capital to succeed in a society that's increasingly dominated by digital IT-related resources in our economy, our society, our political life. Everything from participating in political action online, to potentially voting online, to actually even receiving government services, including immigration benefits online. If these gaps persist in access to those internet resources and digital capital, there's going to be a continuing issue of full political civic integration of this population, and also will hamstring new immigrants in their ability to really achieve in a digital economy, which is really where the higher wages and growth in our country exist. So I think these are the kind of issues that I'd like to kind of introduce into the discussion to think about when we move forward and we talk about CIR in the balance of the day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jason. Shannon and Lisi.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. I'd like to reiterate the appreciation to the staff who coordinated this event, including Melissa Llewellyn, who was very helpful in coordinating our travel. I, too, am somewhat of a Houston native via Southern California and grew up in the southwest part of the city, which was and continues to be a very immigrant-dense community, so it's a bit of a homecoming, like Mark. And I will say that the findings presented here reflect Lacey and I's research, but institutionally, I do have to say that our institution, the University of California, has taken a pretty firm position on the damaging effects of the lack of comprehensive immigration reform on not only our undocumented students, but also their parents and families. So this is something that strikes close to home for us as educators as well. So today what we're going to attempt to do is to move the discussion regarding the economic impact of immigrant workers in the United States, which has been really the central point of CIR, to include a discussion of the families that these workers are embedded in. And so first I'd like to take a step back and help us maybe understand a bit of the role that undocumented immigration plays in a global context. And I just want to take a moment here to be very intentional about the use of that term undocumented, and as others have used here, unauthorized as opposed to illegal. And I would say so not only from an ethical standpoint in terms of how we refer to human beings, in this case our students and our community members, but also as a description of reality. And I commend to you the recent discussion that has been in the news regarding the Associated Press and their discussion about these standards. So take a look at that if you're interested in the rationale there. But just to take a step back, undocumented immigration has certainly been kind of a central issue in our current domestic politics, but this is really an issue that globally we are looking at. 15 to 20%. Can we advance? Which way do we go?
To the right.
Are we using this?
Were you using this one, Jason? Is this the
Yeah,
one?
yeah.
So,
Was it the
okay.
middle one? No, just the right. Just the right.
All right, thank you. All right, to the right. Okay, so 15 to 20% of the global immigrant stock is what we would consider to be undocumented, and other countries use different terms, sans-papiers in France, for example. And about 40% of the immigrant flow to the United States is undocumented. Now, a couple of things, as we've already heard, have been consequential to the experience of undocumented immigrants in the United States. Most recently, I'd say the militarization of the southern border over the last 20 years, which has had two main effects, as the research has shown. One is increasing the dangers of border crossings as people have moved to more dangerous routes, and also decreasing the circularity of migration, neither of which of those has led to necessarily a decrease in the flow. Now, we know that the recent economic recession has certainly impacted the number of undocumented immigrants living in this country, but has not necessarily changed the underlying trend of the economic and family-related reasons why people are coming. Now, the public debate generally has focused on adult male migrants and as workers, and increasingly women workers. But what we would really like to do is kind of think about the deep repercussions of current immigration policies on immigrant families, which include not only parents and their children, but to some extent also extended families and immigrant communities as a whole. Now, in terms of thinking about my area of research, experiences of immigrant workers, about 5.2% of the U.S. labor market is estimated to be undocumented or unauthorized, and those numbers are much higher here in the Harris County, Houston area. And in many ways, I want to just push us a little bit on this idea that the immigration system is broken. Taken from another perspective, the immigration system is actually working perfectly well for those individuals for whom the exploitation of immigrant workers has a real economic benefit. So as we'll see later from some of our other colleagues here, including Stan Merrick, who's here from the business community in Houston, the role of undocumented migration in the workplace has significant impacts on the ability for employers to compete on a fair basis, but also, as we'll talk in a bit, the real experiences of undocumented workers themselves. Now, we know that there's a real lack of available visas for low-wage workers, and that's been kind of a sticking point. The AFL-CIO and the Chamber of Commerce recently came to some sort of negotiated set number of visas, which may be available for low-wage workers. But as it stands right now, the current guest worker program is really a drop in the bucket to reflect the needs of the U.S. economy. And there's been significant discussions around the problematic nature of the guest worker programs. And lastly, I'll just also say that the area of, I'll echo what was said earlier, that the arena of immigration policy really can't be discussed outside of other arenas of policy, including workplace protections. And we are in a peculiar circumstance with undocumented workers, where for the last decade, the Supreme Court has ruled that undocumented workers have clear rights under U.S. and Texas labor law, but their remedies are severely restricted in the way that they aren't for documented workers. Now, the economic precarity that these undocumented workers live in, we want to highlight, does not just impact their lives, but also those of their families. And I'll finish in this slide, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague. 13% of the undocumented population are children, and so the face of the undocumented population is not just workers. And the undocumented population has overall about 5.5 million children, 73% of whom are U.S. citizens. So when we think about who these policies are impacting, we need to be thinking more broadly. And what we're going to talk a bit about today is kind of a two-part effect. One is the effect of poverty on these families. About a third of undocumented immigrants' children are living in poverty, which is about twice the rate of those children of U.S.-born parents. And in conjunction with the damaging effects of the 1996 welfare reform laws, which really excluded non-citizen individuals from many federal benefits, we also have the impact of immigration enforcement, both overt, but also what we've come to refer to as these silent raids. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, who's going to talk a bit about her research in this area.
Thank you, and like everyone else, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. I'll share that I am a qualitative social scientist, which means that I gather my data and my evidence by observing and conversing with people about their lives and understanding how large structural forces impact them. And in this case, I'm looking at immigration laws and how they end up being experienced in intimate ways, in the ways that people develop family relationships, in the way that they understand who they are even. So I want to first go from the information that Shannon has shared about the way that undocumented immigrants are affected in the labor force, to then make the connection with the fact that those workers are also often parents and siblings in families. And so when we talk about the consequences of labor laws and immigration laws, we're not only talking about the workers in those work sites, we're talking about their children and their spouses and their communities, because the fact that they are economically precarious means that their families will also be in those situations. As immigration and social benefits laws have been changing over the past several decades now, there's been a notable reduction to access to social benefits. And it's important to understand, and immigration scholars in general have seen this with past waves of immigration, that families are central. When families thrive, it's a central way for immigrants to thrive more broadly in the U.S. and to integrate, something that we've all been talking about successfully in this country. So not giving families access to the kinds of social services that would make it possible for them to thrive makes it very difficult for them to integrate socially and economically and politically in the country as well. As these paths to the possibility of thriving have been blocked, paths to legalization have also been blocked, making it very difficult to become legal permanent residents once you've arrived in this country without documentation. At the same time, the grounds for deportation have expanded, and we've seen with the record numbers of deportations and hear the stories, in the media, particularly Spanish language media, about people being stopped for having a broken tail light, and then that leading to deportation, about people being taken away for fishing without a license. And you hear these stories over and over about things that are not criminal activities that lead to detention and deportation. And there's been also a series of policies, including things like 287G and secure communities, programs that make it much more possible for local law enforcement to conduct racial profiling, so that people really are in fear of deportation for very good reasons, as we've seen with the record numbers. The other really important point that I think we often miss in these discussions about immigration is that we think immigration policies and detention and deportation, these enforcement policies in particular, affect only undocumented immigrants. And the reality is that it affects U.S. citizens as well in many different ways, but these consequences are very visible in families. As we mentioned, mixed status families, in which maybe the children are born here, maybe the undocumented immigrant is married to a U.S. citizen. In all of these cases, the fact that only one of their members is undocumented doesn't mean that the consequences affect only that person. It affects the entire family. When we're talking about a family relying on the wages of an undocumented worker, it means that the entire family is going to be in a precarious situation financially. They will have to live in areas of dense poverty, which means access to only schools that have low resources, high crime rates, very little access to opportunities that would, again, allow them to thrive in this country. And increasingly, what I'm finding in my research is that the fear, that possibility of deportation, even if it is for only one member of a family, is a burden that all of the members of that family have to carry. Indeed, it becomes a debilitating fear that prevents parents sometimes from taking their children to school if they've heard that there's been a raid nearby. It's a fear that prevents them from taking children to see doctors, and for preventative medicine in particular, because there's that fear that you can be detained in any place at any time now. You can be detained for calling the police to report a crime in some cases, and we hear the stories over and over. And so children are growing up in these families where even if they are not the target of those enforcement policies, there's the possibility that their parent can leave to go to work and never come back. There's the possibility that this can happen at any moment. And so people talk about carrying that vulnerability and that fear, and it's not a great way to grow up and to really embrace this place as home, even if you are a U.S. citizen. So with that, we want to get to the policy implications, and particularly in the interest of time, just say that legalization clearly is one of the key things, and we're seeing these conversations being discussed. We've heard about the importance of making sure that the number of visas matches the need for those visas as one of these areas that needs to be further considered. In the process of implementing these laws, to the extent that they've been taking place at record numbers now, there really hasn't been much attention to the consequences on the families, the U.S. citizen relatives of those people who are deported. And it really shouldn't be acceptable to us that children are suffering in this process. We really want to emphasize that children's well-being should be at the center of the policies that are being developed now.
And we'll just end by kind of, again, re-echoing the discussion that immigration policies aren't the only policy arena that affect these undocumented immigrants and their families, but also other policy arenas, and especially workplace protections, which is also concurrently in the news. So I encourage us to think more broadly about the effects that has not only on immigrant workers themselves, but also broader labor markets. And lastly, I just want to highlight for you an action that is happening tomorrow at 11:30 at Smith and Clay in downtown Houston. And for those of you who are interested in kind of what's locally happening in this community regarding pushing for immigration reform, I put that on your calendar. Okay.
Thank you. I now have the difficult task of summarizing 4 excellent presentations and 4 excellent papers. So I want to again thank all the authors for their presentations and for their papers, which were all a pleasure to read preceding this conference. The papers offer, I'll say the papers offer very refreshing and important contextualization of the immigrant reform movement, as well as why reform is critical for mitigating rising socioeconomic challenges that are rising from our current, and I won't say the word broken because that's overused, but poorly functioning immigration system. And if you look at the papers both individually and cumulatively, they present a very nuanced and novel approach to understanding a few different things. One, the policies and politics of CIR discussions today. 2, the Latino effect on getting the country to where it is today. And then I would also say 2 corresponding and key socioeconomic issues tied to reform. The shifting population dynamics and immigrant integration, as well as the need to rethink policies, Shannon and Leslie were just mentioning, that harm families, especially the children of undocumented or mixed status families, which is really an issue that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Each paper can be discussed in its own right, but it's also possible to weave them together to ask a few important questions. How do we get here? Where are we going? And where must we go? And I think that's what these 4 papers really present a very nuanced perspective on. To set the stage, what can get lost in immigration reform discussions is a more thorough understanding of why reform is now at the center of national policy and the implications of this. Yes, the Latino electorate in the 2012 election were critical in moving CIR forward, but as David describes how moving immigration forward must be looked at in the context of other policy dynamics, which I found particularly interesting, especially the movement in this country toward same-sex equality, drug control policies, and evangelical support for reform. And I would say especially that in the drug control and the same-sex equality, those are issues that are not necessarily associated with immigration reform, but are really interesting to think about as the country is shifting in this direction. Another lesson from the election is that anti-immigrant politics can turn off Latino voters overall, and David mentions that. He also makes an important distinction between immigration policy versus immigration politics, noting that Latinos hold diverse viewpoints on how our immigration system should work, but cautions that even those who might be considered as having conservative viewpoints still do not favor a negative, demonizing political debate. And that is really key, is that even though a lot of there's a segment of the Latino electorate that, yes, immigration reform might not be not their top issue, politics that demonize immigrants and that demonize Latinos overall have reverberations across the community, because it's not a clear-cut case of unauthorized versus authorized immigrants. There's, as Lizzie and Shannon were mentioning, in families are generally oftentimes mixed status. Somebody with documentation might have a friend who's undocumented. It's not a black and white issue. It's very much a gray issue, and these types of demonizing political debates really have those reverberations across the community. And then another question is, are Republicans lining up in support of reform because they see it as a way to garner support, or do they simply want it off the table in order to win over Latino voters in other areas? David mentions the issue of California in the 1990s. I'd also point to the many Republican legislatures who now, in many states, regret passage of restrictive state policies. Maybe you don't see that as much in Arizona, but I've seen that in the work that I've been doing in Alabama, for example, in Birmingham and other places, that you actually have some of the Republican state senators, Republicans, members of the state legislature overall, who didn't really realize the effects of their policies HB 87 was going to have in Alabama from an economic standpoint, and now would rather just have some of these issues off the table. And that's at a local policy, but obviously this is also very much carries over to a national framework. Ali, in his paper, shows how this perception of overall Latino support for immigration reform, which David argues is a key factor in immigration politics, must actually be looked at from the perspective of local dynamics, and shows how the size of local Latino populations, as well as the degree of political competition between Republican and Democratic candidates in local voting, help to determine Latino voter issue priorities on immigration. So basically, I think one of the crux of Ali's paper is that while Latinos overall support immigration reform, all politics is local, right? And And he finds that larger Latino populations result in less attention paid to the issue of immigration among Latino registered voters, and concludes this may be because Latinos are more secure or face friendlier local immigration policies due to their higher numbers. But in electorally competitive counties, increasing Latino population share is linked to greater attention to the issue of immigration. Now, not necessarily in neighborhoods, not necessarily in neighborhoods in the smaller localities, but on the county level, he finds that. And his findings are also consistent with what we observe from my work in leading the American Society of Council of America's immigration initiative on the ground, and working in 10 different new immigrant gateway cities over the last 5 years, including New York and DC. And the top issue for Latinos are largely the same as what we see across the population, right? It's economy, it's jobs, education, it's healthcare. But immigration can have more resonance in counties with low numbers of Latinos as a percentage of the overall population. And perhaps, and I think as Allie's alluding to, this is because fewer Latinos can mean less understanding among the local population of the heterogeneity of the Latino population. It can also raise the fear factor, which some immigrant skeptics play into. And I would also note that there is which Allie's paper doesn't have the chance to get into, but there's also a bifurcation in the Latino population as well. So not just looking at kind of the issue of county level support or Mexican American support or Puerto Rican support or Cuban support, but also insofar as the generations across the Latino population, that they're oftentimes first generation, second generation Latinos versus second, third, or fourth generation Latinos have different perspectives on the need for immigration reform. And with the Latino families, Latino leaders in the communities who have been here for multiple generations say, oh, we're beyond this. This is something that we're now very entrenched in the community, and this is an issue for the newcomers to the community. And so I think that there is that tension that I've at least observed in different cities between those two different aspects of the Latino population. And one of Allie's recommendations as well is to look at the importance of contextualizing the immigration debate along the economics, right? Because Latinos overall, depending on it doesn't matter how long you've been in the country, it doesn't matter what group you are. The economy is really, really key, and I think you see this with the national immigration discussion as we've been following that over the last few months. Is increasingly groups are tying the imperative of immigration reform to the economy, and I'll say that's give a little plug for our work. That's something that we've really been focusing on as well, and have been doing a series of fact sheets on get the facts. Top 5 reasons why immigrants drive the economy. Top 5 reasons why immigrants drive entrepreneurship. 5 reasons why immigrants are important for the talent mismatch that we see in this country. We have a high unemployment rate, but we also have thousands of jobs that go unfilled every week, and every month, and that's part of that is because of the talent mismatch. The more that advocates for immigration reform can tie reform to the economic policy discussion, the better. And hopefully this year will be the moment for passage of CIR, and I'm optimistic that will happen. And that leads us to Lisi and Shannon's paper, which looks at how tighter border control policies have meant that many undocumented have stayed in the country and brought a corresponding increase in unauthorized women and children. And they do a great job of combining anecdotes with statistics to show the effect on families. And the children are often the ones who live in fear or with little opportunity through no fault of their own. Their parents came to the U.S. for a better life, but the children have no viable pathway out of poverty. And you see really high levels of poverty among the children especially of the undocumented. And this is particularly salient as lawmakers put together an immigration bill. They talk about workplace violations in their paper, and one of the proposals as part of the immigration reform bill is this new W visa, which is a visa for low-skilled workers that actually allows workers to change jobs under this visa. So you come in under W visa, you're not beholden to your employer to stay in the country, which I think can oftentimes lead to different workplace violation issues or fear of talking about workplace safety. And if CIR passes, and the undocumented are put on a path to citizenship. One of my questions is how many of these family issues described in this paper may potentially change as a result of that. And I'm going to be cognizant of my own time. But finally, Jason lays out two paths going forward in his paper. He talks about the status quo or an alternative path. And I think that the status quo, I think we're increasingly seeing, Jason wrote his paper, I think 2 months ago, we're increasingly seeing that the status quo appears very unlikely. But what is necessary is a greater focus on immigrant integration, which is partly shaped by English proficiency and a factor not as commonly discussed, which is access to high-speed internet. And not only access to internet, but also access to understanding how the internet works and how that can be used for moving forward in society, both as entrepreneurs, as workers, and whatnot. And Jason's paper also makes a strong argument for why any congressional deal must include a pathway to citizenship. There has been various discussions, over the last few months. Are we talking about legalization? Are we talking about legalization as a pathway to citizenship? I think increasingly the Gang of Eight has moved toward a pathway to citizenship, but with various stipulations. One of the stipulations being discussed, we haven't seen the bill yet, is that the border must first be declared secure for any immigrants who are legal to move forward on a pathway to citizenship. Now, how do you, with a commission of border governors and others? Now that's a potential backdoor approach to preventing citizenship, right? Because you leave it in the hands of somebody else to declare the border secure, who may or may not have interest in declaring the border secure, because that will result in a path to citizenship. But Jason's paper really notes how naturalization is likely the strongest indicator of civic engagement, and citizenship must be achieved. There's the 10 to 12 time frame that's been talked about, but I think that needs to happen on an even shorter time frame to be able to increase civic engagement. Another point Jason makes is how the foreign-born are increasingly settling in non-traditional localities, which poses both opportunities and challenges. And that's also something that I've seen firsthand over the last 5 years through our work, is that one of the things with immigrants settling in non-traditional localities, and I was in fact in New Orleans last week, another non-traditional locality. Jason mentioned Charlotte and others. We'll actually be having a meeting on May 30th. But cities at a local level, which we haven't talked about, are really grappling with immigrant integration. We oftentimes talk about immigrant integration at a national level, but really it comes down to cities, and it comes down to localities to figure out how to best facilitate integration, whether it's civic integration or whether it's economic integration, or overall, how do you move cities in the direction of being able to better tap into their immigrant populations, and this must happen independent of CIR. CIR is not the answer to all of this. CIR is an important step along the process, but integration must really happen at the city level. And I think that getting to where we need to go in the months ahead will require, as David reminds us, that immigrant and Latino groups continue to play a strong role and remind politicians of the strength of their votes. That will be done. Shannon mentioned it in Houston tomorrow, as well as Washington, D.C. tomorrow. There's a huge rally. Tens of thousands of immigrant advocates will be convening on the Capitol at tomorrow's rally. And those types of rallies are important for showing the voice, the face of the Latino population, the immigrant advocate population beyond the elections. And as Ali notes, the Latino population is not necessarily overwhelmingly is not necessarily all concerned with immigration, but the Mexican American population is, and that's really a population that needs to consistently get out there in support of reform. So looking forward, one of the things we have to not forget is the fact that even with reform, the changing face of America is frankly, I've seen this in work in cities of Milwaukee, Birmingham, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee. The changing face of America is scary for people in many parts of the country. Immigrants are increasingly settling in new destinations. Folks are not used to these changing demographics in their communities. And I think one of the real keys moving forward, in addition, along with immigration reform, is for really engaging local populations and having them get to know their immigrant neighbors, in multiple ways that can allow populations to connect on a person-to-person level, whether that's festivals, whether that's various meetings in which at the schools or whatnot, but really having that type of connection with the local immigrant population, and realizing that there is no more us and them, that it's all us, and that is really key for moving forward. And this is, I think, what's also going to be really important for creating a cohesive new American mosaic, not to borrow from the name from the conference, a new American mosaic for the 21st century. I have questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to leave my questions to the panelists aside so that we can open up to questions from the audience. We have handheld mics that are available, which we'll pass around. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. If you don't have a question, I promise I have questions for the panelists. But I'd like to get the audience engaged. Yes. If you could please identify yourself too.
Raul Hinojosa. Not to steal my thunder that I'm going to present in a minute on two issues, but I'm really questioning why we yet have not identified the tipping point. I think David's point, what really changed that day, right? It's fascinating if you look at last year and all of a sudden the discourse, where is the missing voices that were so prevalent over all of last year? Is it? And I'm still wondering, what your interpretations of the tipping point that really is going to be characterizing this moment, not only on immigration, but as you say, a couple of other issues. Jason, in digital citizenship, interesting, but what's really interesting, I'll talk about this also, is the financial citizenship. Okay, the huge impact on families that really matters, and that is really the critical question is how quickly are you going to be able to move people into the financial. That is what overwhelms the economics of this. And by the way, they all use cell phones now. They don't necessarily. It's beyond the computers. They got the smartphones.
Thanks, David. Do I take the first part?
Okay. Is this working here? Well, I'll say that politics is about perception, and that I think that the 2012 election created this perception that Latino power had become real. There'd been lots of talk about Latino power for decades. The 80s was supposed to be the decade of the Latino, and then the 90s, and then the 2000s, and it just sort of kept on going, and Latino political power never quite seemed to match what the public political discussion said it should, although I think academics, this is one of their benefits, is that they've always been saying that Latino political power was contingent and that it wasn't as strong as just numbers in the population indicated, but nobody listened to us, of course, and so I think that the 2012 election suggested that maybe this reality, this perception of power had really become reality. People were just surprised by the large numbers, they were surprised by the election outcome, and these things all kind of meshed together to create this moment where people thought there was a tipping point. So I think that there's a perception of a tipping point, just like in politics, there's lots of perceptions about things that just sort of come about that, I don't think we can sort of point to like a number or a percentage or any one dynamic and say that was the tipping point. I think there's a tipping point when people think there's a tipping point, and clearly people think so. So, real political power and perceived political power is all basically the same thing. If people think you have power, then you have power. So maybe people think that Latinos have power in a way that they didn't used to.
And Ali, before we go on the financial question.
Yeah, I just wanted to address this point as well. So I agree that perception is certainly important, but in this election cycle, we really had advances in polling. Where we didn't, and polling specifically of the Latino population using fully bilingual callers, that gives us very accurate estimates of their level of support in various states. Something, again, that we didn't have in previous election cycles. And in fact, there's very clear evidence that in at least 4 key states, in Florida, in Colorado, surprisingly in New Mexico, which is not usually considered a swing state, and I'm forgetting the 4th state.
Nevada.
Nevada, yes. So in these 4 states, The margin of victory that President Obama received from the Latino vote was enough to contribute to his overall victory and winning these 4 states, right? And so there's very clear evidence that at least in these 4 key states, 3 of which are battlegrounds, the Latino vote was actually pivotal, did reach a tipping point, and we have good evidence that that was the case. And without those states, it's unclear whether Obama would have been able to win.
Jason, you want to take the footing?
Yeah, I take those points. I guess when you look at the financial component, there's maybe 2 dimensions. One has to do with you may be speaking of the fees required to naturalize, which have been raised as an issue that may prevent people from moving through the naturalization process. But the other piece, I think, is that there is a empirically demonstrated premium to citizenship that immigrants receive when they become citizens. They go through the naturalization process, economically, socially, politically, et cetera. And that's why addressing that gap in the number of people who are eligible to naturalize and those that do, I think is an important one to look at going forward.
Thank you. As I see, yes, please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Linda Vega. I guess one question and then there's a follow-up. Someone said, I believe it was Ali, who was surprised that Latinos voted on the economic issue more than on the immigration issue. And if you consider how many are naturalized and vote and so, that's really the reason why many immigrants come to the U.S. is economic issues. It's the desire to achieve that American dream. So that's not so inconsistent unless there was a follow-up question in the studies or whoever did the studies on that. And looking at the 71% who did vote for Obama, did anyone consider out of the 1.6 million who were deported, the percentage who were males? Perhaps they left behind female wives who weren't able to fend for themselves, and how many of that 71% was actually female voting for Obama? That probably was a large number.
Thank you. Ellie.
So on the second point, I haven't looked at that, so I don't know the gender breakout. But on your first, it's actually the opposite. So I find that immigration, the issue of immigration, is what's really key for predicting Democratic Party identification as well as vote choice in the last election. It is true that proportionally more Latinos are identifying the economy and jobs as their most important concern than they do identify immigration. But when we take into account all these other individual level characteristics and differences, as well as where these individual Latinos live, it turns out that the economy is not predictive of vote choice in the way that immigration, the issue of immigration is. And so it's true that sort of, that there is more attention to the economy in general. When we're doing it in a multivariate setting, it turns out that the immigration issue is more important for deciding a Latino voter's vote choice.
Shannon or Lisi, do you want to address the deportation question since you've looked at that?
Your question was whether or not, what percentage of deportees' family members were potential voters?
Well, my question was, out of the 71% who voted for Obama, how many of them were in fact affected from the deportation that happened, 1.6, and were many of them female?
I haven't done research on that. I'm not sure you have, but I would take a look at some of the work that the Pew Hispanic Center has done. They did a survey of Latinos a while back, and maybe you guys can help me, that asked the question on how many of you fear that you may be deported, fear that a family member might be deported, and this was asked about Latinos, and those numbers are quite high, over 50%, even for US-born individuals. So I think for your specific question, I don't have data, but Pew has done some broad polling of Latinos to look at the question of deportation, even amongst US born.
Yeah, I looked at it, didn't have it.
Well, can I just ask what your hunch is about that dynamic?
I'm an immigration attorney. I'm also the founder of Latinos Ready to Vote. So I go out into the community and I talk to people and get them to naturalize. So it's, for the last 5-6 years that I've been doing this, I've been asking people.
But is your sense that those families that are affected by deportation action would be more or less likely to support Obama? And
yes, because if the majority who were deported were male, the only way to get them back into the U.S. is to apply for what's called the a waiver, a hardship waiver that emphasizes why you need that male or income earner back to the U.S. And what we report to USCIS is the need to be on entitlements or depression, or the children are doing poorly, and it's mostly females. So, and they're U.S. citizens. So we're conditioning people, or these females, to think that they need the dependency on the government. So we're creating these voters who are voting for entitlements rather than opportunity and independence.
Thank you.
I will just say on that one, I mean, one of the things that Shannon, Lisa, you do mention in your paper is the effect of the deportations on families and on women and especially on children who grow up in families often without a male head of household, and what type of effects that creates moving forward. So, not specifically to your question, but I think tied to your question. I think we have time for maybe one or two other questions, and there's a few. So what I'm going to do is there's 4 hands up. I'm going to take all 4 together, and then we'll answer all 4, and then we'll wrap up. If you could just identify your name and affiliation.
Well, my name is Vincent, and the U.S. used to be much more open to immigration, a country built on immigrants. And my question is, so what's the problem? Is it only that the government believes it will destroy the economy if they open their doors? Will it destroy the economy? How much of that is just fear? And has anyone done the math answering the question of how it will affect the U.S. economy and how that math weighs against a whole bunch of untaxed illegal immigrants? Because it used to be a successful plan.
Thank you. I got 2 questions in the back. If you could stand, if there's a microphone coming over to you, can you get the microphone and bring it? If you could just wait for the microphone. Hold on 1 second. Thank you.
Those of us that have worked voluntarily for various organizations that are in the schools, say a robotics program, what we have discovered is that the children are brilliant. You know, they come up to me and say, "Oh, Mrs. Allen, I want to go to Rice." And yet when their parents come to pick them up, they do not speak English. So here is that generation that is working so hard, but they don't have people at home that have really assimilated into our country by our national language. Do you have ideas on how we get that great group that doesn't speak English to join us in the English language?
Okay, and then the last question, if you could just identify yourself, please.
I'm Maida Osofsky. I'm from the ACLU of Texas. I wanted to ask Professor Valenzuela if it's fair when evaluating Latinos' attitudes towards immigration and the economy to put Puerto Ricans in the same category with the rest of the Latino immigrants.
Great. And I think those all the questions were pressed on time. I want to say, just before I turn to the panelists, for the first question on how will it affect the economy, I'll point to the work that we've done as well as the work that Partnership for New American Economy, Mayor Bloomberg's group that I work very closely with has done, Migration Policy Institute, Mark's former employer, and others have done on specifically looking at how the U.S. economy will benefits from immigrants and will actually benefit from authorization of the undocumented. I think Eric had printed out some of these fact sheets outside, but I'm going to turn over to the panelists. So we have 3 questions here. Why is the U.S. not as open to immigrants, and how will it affect our economy? How do we facilitate English language access? And then specifically directed to you, Ali, about the Puerto Rican population. So why don't you start?
Sure, I'll start. So my interest in my work was to look at Latino voter opinion on immigration and the economy across contexts, right? And so not specifically only on immigrant Latinos. I actually don't group Puerto Ricans with all other national origin groups. I treat them as a separate, distinct group and assess their opinions about these issues. I think I understand your concern that Puerto Ricans are not facing the same kinds of challenges on immigration as other national origin groups. Certainly that's the case, and of course helps us to understand and make sense of their relatively lower levels of attention to this issue compared to all the other national origin groups.
Thanks. Actually, Jason, can I ask you to take the question on facilitating English language access?
Sure. I'll try to take that one. As your question alluded to, the good news in this story is that the empirical data is very, very strong now about second-generation Latinos learning English at rates equivalent or even better than other foreign-born populations. So that second-generation impact is in good shape. I guess on the first-generation impact, we just need to pay more attention to ways in which we can engage local communities, local nonprofits, maybe consider other parts of national policy to encourage English learning as a process of integration, as a process of acquiring citizenship. We haven't really had a national immigrant integration policy in this country, and some folks might say that the issues of language acquisition, digital citizenship, other things that we've talked about today need to be part of a conversation about a national immigrant policy that would integration policy that would advance and bring those levels of English proficiency up among some elements of that first generation of immigrants to try to help make sure that they're integrated properly in society, economically, socially, politically, and culturally.
And I'll also add to that the research shows that all Latinos value English. Even recent Spanish-dominant migrants, they value English. They understand the importance of learning English. It's clear from their environment that you function better if you know English, and large percentages of them report trying, either through like buying language tapes or talking to family or friends. And so I think it's always tough to learn a new language, especially as an adult. And I think it's always been tough historically. I think sometimes we have this image that people came in the 19th century and they just kind of picked up English right away, but there's lots of evidence that foreign languages continued for long periods of time in immigrant communities, even in the 19th, early 20th century. So I think it's always been tough. It's still tough, but there's a lot of evidence people are trying, and everybody knows that it's important and wants to learn English.
Sharon Luisi, do you want to reflect on that as well, especially in regard to children?
I was going to say, from a very micro perspective, if you talk to immigrants, there's a few different things going on that makes it difficult to access services that would help them learn English. One of them is the fact that they're working so hard, multiple jobs, just to barely make it, right? They're being exploited, there's wage theft, and not making it, so there's very little time. But also, we have all these policies, and the way that people talk about them, and particularly the media and the way that they've been portrayed, they're dehumanized. They know that there's a chance that any access with any kind of formal institutions might lead to detention and deportation. So that really prevents people from seeking out contact with anyone who isn't very much a trusted person. Yeah. So we're pushing them away in some sense.
And I'll just end by just giving two plugs. One, if you look at the research on the cognitive benefits of bilingualism, children who acquire dual languages actually tend to fare better. So there is some research on that. And also, to get to Jason's point about national immigrant integration policies, in this country, most of our integration dollars are focused on refugee populations, which is very important. But if we look at the example of other countries like our neighbor to the north, that might give us some model for how to think about federal funding towards immigrant integration at the local level. That also doesn't have to necessarily occur in a monolingual context. Yeah. So we can kind of take a look at other options as well.
Thanks, Shannon.
And let me just reemphasize one point that David made about the difficulty of adults learning a new language. There is very, very good research on this question, and immigrants who come to a new host society as adults, basically beyond the age of about 11 or 12 years old. The development of the brain is such that language learning is just monumentally more difficult. And I've looked at numerous patterns about the relationship between age of arrival and English language acquisition and educational attainment, income, political interest, and all of it drops off among adult immigrants. So, that's a structural problem that is just a matter of human nature and our development. And so, it's a difficult thing for adult immigrants, whereas for children immigrants, I think that's where the real intervention on language acquisition in particular can be quite fruitful.
I could definitely identify with that with my attempt to try and learn Portuguese later in life rather than just Spanish. And then the last question, which is actually the first one, is why is the U.S. not as open to immigrants, and how will is it a fear factor? How does it affect our economy? Who wants to take that? David, you've been looking a little bit more.
Well, I think you said something about why don't we have open border policies? We used to in the past, essentially, especially for the Americas and for Mexico. Well, I think if we did that, we would see a lot more circular migration. I mean, we used to have a migration pattern of temporary, seasonal migration. People would come, but they wouldn't stay. They wouldn't necessarily bring families. Yes, there was some permanent migration, but when you put up a big wall, it just creates the incentives to not go back, because it raises the cost of going across the border. You're more inclined to bring your family to make it permanent migration. So I think if we had maybe not an open border, but if we did even have that or something like that, I think we would just have a lot more sort of circular migration going on. I think people might be surprised by the dynamics that play out. I think people assume that if you lower the wall, every single person from Latin America will want to come to the U.S., but most people want to stay where they're born and they're raised and their families and friends are. So I think you'd find a lot more sort of movement back and forth under a more sort of open system.
Thank you. With that, I want if you could join me again in thanking our panelists for an excellent first discussion. We're now going to take a 15-minute coffee break. We're 10 minutes behind schedule, so we'll reconvene in 15 minutes for our next panel on security, the economy, and immigration.